it is a fantasy of mine to imagine a situation in which the proponents and opponents of militarism can engage in actual academic debate. So within that fantasy, I'm looking on this session as a dry run for such an event, a training session, if you like, for a debating team that might one day speak to the proposition that militarism is a threat to our security. So, on the panel, we have John Hallam from People for Nuclear Disarmament, Denis Doherty from the Australian Anti-Bases Campaign Coalition, Margot Pearson from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Allan Behm from the Australia Institute, and Bevan Ramsden from the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and we'll start with John Hallam. Now, John is a long-term activist and nuclear disarmament campaigner. His focus is on the threat that nuclear weapons pose for all of us. He campaigns relentlessly and internationally on nuclear issues. His work has resulted in resolutions in the Australian Senate, the European Parliament, and even at the UN's General Assembly. His current work is centered on trying to persuade the General Assembly to adopt a resolution on no first use of nuclear weapons. So over to you, John.
I also have a few hats which are not kind of exactly visible in quite the way that Nick's hat was visible. And one of them is of the Abolition 2000s working group on nuclear risk reduction. And somehow I seem to have been spending a lot of my life on nuclear risk reduction. Nuclear risk reduction isn't quite as sexy as abolition, and risk reduction and abolition need to go on in parallel. Abolition means you get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. Risk reduction is that you adopt various procedures which are designed to ensure that you don't accidentally incinerate the entire planet. And that phrase, accidentally incinerate the entire planet, probably flows off my tongue a little more easily than most people are kind of used to. You need to get used to thinking in those sorts of terms. But perhaps the best way I can illustrate that is by recalling the occasion back in 1974 when a rather junior military officer at Strategic Command sent the go codes to everything in the United States arsenal and did not know that he had done so. I hasten to add that he did later get fired for doing that, and that there was a general at the other end of the room who saw the big board light up and went, "Oh shit," and issued a countermand to that command. The risk, as it now stands, of nuclear war, the risk of an accidental apocalypse is as great or greater than it has ever been. The hands of the doomsday clock have never been closer to midnight, midnight being the end of everything that we know about, than they are now. And that includes during the darkest days of the Cold War. On the 26th of September 1983, the world nearly ended. And the reason that it didn't end was because of a certain Russian colonel who decided that he would not take the steps that he was supposed to pick up a red phone and say, "Missiles incoming." Instead, he picked up the red phone and said, "I am transmitting false data." And a voice at the other end of the phone said, are you quite sure about that? And he said, yes, I'm sure, and put the phone down. He said later he wasn't at all sure, but he waited for the missiles to impact, and nothing happened, and the world had been saved. Had he gone according to the book, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. 26th of September is now the International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. My plea is that accidental nuclear war, indeed, not so accidental nuclear war, that nuclear war is very, very much on the cards today. It is as relevant as it was during the coldest, darkest days of the Cold War. It is the most immediate, short-term, immediate-term threat to the survival of humans as a species and to the survival of civilization. Global warming will take between 50 and 100 years to make the planet uninhabitable. Nuclear weapons can do it in 90 minutes, and they can do it tomorrow. And the consensus of expert opinion is that they are more likely to do it now than at any other time in history. And yet we seem to be asleep at the wheel. There is a desperate need for people to refocus on that same hoary old issue that has been going for 60 years and to say, we do not want to be toast. We do not want to freeze in the dark after everybody else has become toast. And we want our governments to take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that that doesn't happen. And what is happening instead is that our governments are taking exactly the opposite kinds of measures. Investing in nuclear submarines, for example. And they are taking diplomatic steps that ensure that the kind of confrontation that could all too easily escalate into the apocalypse can take place. I'll leave it at that, but I do urge people to refocus on that hoary old, grumpy old, ugly old issue that has been there since the early 1960s.
Thank you, John. A very pertinent warning for all of us. Something to think about deeply. Our next speaker is Denis Doherty.
We can't hear you, Nick.
Why ever not?
Nick, your volume is way down.
Unfortunately, we now can't hear you at all.
Right.
I'm at a loss.
It's better. It's better now. You're
Okay.
fine now. Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So I was going to introduce our next speaker and thanking John for his contribution there.
Nick,
Yes.
sorry, I think maybe you're putting a piece of paper in front of the microphone. It made it go quiet again.
Can you hear me now?
No.
I'm as close as I can get.
Yep, that's better now.
Okay. I'll try to talk to the microphone. Okay. Our next speaker is Denis Doherty. Sorry, Denis, for the delay. But one thing, before we go to Denis, I just want to mention the fact that 5 o'clock tonight, ICANN is conducting another session in the Raising Peace series. And ICANN is the International Campaign on Nuclear Weapons. They'll be focusing on the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, whereas John, who we were just listening to, is focused on the no first use of nuclear weapons. Okay, so let's move on to Denis. Denis is a former school teacher and active member of the Teachers Union. He's well known for his community building work and his advocacy for justice. He's a prominent member of the peace movement in Sydney. He's organised and coordinated marches and rallies for peace over many years. He's a leader of the Australian Anti-Bases Campaign Coalition, which was mainly focused on the presence of US-sponsored facilities and bases on Australian territory, particularly Pine Gap. So Denis, you've got the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. And I acknowledge the traditional owners, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I also acknowledge all the people who are in the audience. When it comes to the topic of militarism, the announcement on Thursday just blew all my notes away, and I had to start again. The militarism in Australia boils down to an exaltation of military virtues and a policy of aggressive military preparedness. Nuclear-powered submarines are the supreme example of aggressive military preparedness. In Australia, there are many myths surrounding the military. Anzac Day and these myths are a prominent feature. Education Minister Allan recently called Anzac Day the most sacred of all days. What tosh! It's a complete glorification of war. The government is going into spending overdrive in buying these nuclear attack submarines, and both major parties have endorsed the agreement. On top of this, the government maintains a cloak of secrecy over military information. The power of arms corporations, the arms corporation lobby is mighty. Many have branches in Australia, and they have retired politicians and former Australian military officers as their heads. The revolving door of politicians and military officers is something that many Australians are not aware of. The government gifted the Australian arms manufacturing companies a subsidy of $2 billion to lift Australia's ranking in arms sales from 2 billion from 20th to 10th in the world. Compare this with Australia never reaching the UN standard for aid for a country such as ours, which is a measly 0.7% of GDP. During the COVID pandemic, the government continued buying weapons, and military operations such as exercises and patrols in the South China Sea continued. Now we learn that they were secretly negotiating the AUKUS agreement while this pandemic was going on, and this agreement destroys any chance we ever had of cooperation to fight the virus across the globe. The purchase of nuclear-powered versus diesel submarines indicates that Australia is buying to defend US interests. Diesel submarines would protect our sea trade better than nuclear ones. The decision means that Australia is aiming to be part of a coalition force, such as the ones that attacked Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and now perhaps China. The US-Australian military alliance is a wholly negative force. We must continue to campaign to break this alliance and opt for an independent, non-aligned nation. Anti-militarism covers a wide range of topics and situations. While the joy that has greeted the nuclear subs announcement among mainstream media commentators, we must not be put off or feel defeatist in the face of this wave of militarism we have witnessed since last Thursday. There is general anger about this move both here in the US and in the UK. We held a peace movement Zoom conference over the weekend, and we were overwhelmed by the numbers who turned up. We have adopted a public statement, and there are other good statements all being made by various people around Australia. We have adopted a petition, and peace activists are out campaigning on this petition as we speak. Let's get big numbers on it, and the Friends of the Earth have a similar petition, and we must get onto that as soon as possible. When I looked at our one, we were nearly 500 signatures, and it's only been up for 24 hours. I put the links to the statement and the petition in the chat, where you'll also be able to find the campaigning outline for those in lockdown and for those who are not. I've also put the telephone numbers for Morrison and for Anthony Albanese, and there was a campaign today to ring them. I did my duty this morning and was quickly got rid of. But as many people as possible, please ring those two people. Already there are strong links across the nation, but we need to deepen the response in every centre and every group by reaching out to every ally possibly, including unions and churches. One campaign high point must be May 10th to the 12th, 2022, because that is the date of the Indo-Pacific Expo, which is a maritime arms fair with over 600 exhibitors and 21 heads of Navy from around the world. AUKUS and their nuclear subs must be met with determined resistance in the same or even greater way than the recent Brisbane Land Forces exhibition protests organised by the Wage Peace Organisation. Internationally, the US group Code Pink has stated if Biden and the Pentagon want to ensure peace and stability in the region, they could simply stop dealing missiles, weapons and nuclear technology to Australia, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan. The UK group No Cold War Coalition says AUKUS is an aggressive move which threatens peace and stability in the Pacific region. We encourage all to engage with the Peace Bureau's campaign called the Global Days of Action on Military Spending. The campaign runs from mid-March to mid-April and culminates in the publication of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, of the worldwide figures of military spending. In summary, wherever you are, take hold of the near edge of militarism and shake it as hard as you can. Do your research, find allies, extend your reach through fellow groups here and abroad. Join the Gadams campaign. Together we can build a movement to stop militarism and build peace in our region. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Denis.
You're quiet again, Nick.
Thank you, Denis. Thank you. Denis, have you put the date for the maritime into the chat?
I put the website.
Right. Thank you very much for that.
Just look for Indo-Pacific Expo.
Right.
.org or something like that. Yeah.
Grand. So I invite people to have a look at that. And that sounds like a very important event at which to express how you feel about the nuclear subs. Okay, our next speaker. Let's move on. Now, we've got a male-dominated panel, but that should not diminish the role that women play in the peace movement. And my own experience is that they play a very active role. So I'm delighted that we'll now be joined by Margot Pearson. Margot joined WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, back in the 1980s. She's now the treasurer of WILP's New South Wales branch. WILP is dedicated to finding peaceful means of preventing and ending armed conflict. It works to increase the participation of women in peace processes through the advancement of gender equality. Now, WILP has also recently completed a report, Militarisation in Australia, Normalisation and Mythology. And I'd just add that Margot was one of the, or WILP through Margot, was one of the groups that was instrumental in getting Raising Peace started. So Margot, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yes, I am very aware as the nuclear submarine topic has dominated now, I think, most people's thoughts about what's going on and what ought to be going on. Petitions are getting put out there and so forth. However, what I would like to do is also just talk a little bit about our report and the basis for that. We were in our WILP Australia, I just hope everybody's aware, WILP is an international outfit. And of course, we also have people at Geneva and people in New York working on various areas of disarmament. But as well as that, here in Australia, we also have our own particular issues to work on. So it is important, I think, very important to actually think about the nature of militarization in Australia, even at a time like this where we are facing what is almost like a crisis in terms of what's going on. So I would just like to talk a little bit about what came out in our report. And our report is actually not about militarization in the sense of establishing weapons or attacking other people, etc. It's not that part of the militarization that we were interested in, as finding what would be the ground, you might say, for what we needed to do was look at the nature of militarization in Australia and how it really shaped a lot of the thinking and activity that goes on. So what we tried to uncover was how that happened. And it's really, really important to actually think through what militarization means here in Australia. Our research focused on the beginning, and which Nick has referred to already, that is the fact that the founding of Australia was involved in warfare with the locals who were there or here already. And of course, it has also been the case that warfare has been really sort of a running theme, you might say, as far as I can tell, in Australian history. I have to just confess for a moment that I actually came from New Zealand, but anyway, it really is important that we do this, because the nature of militarization in Australia is going to actually be very important in terms of how far the people who are going to try and overturn this business about the armaments, that is the nuclear subs, is really, we have, you might say, quite an ingrained form of militarism here in Australia. And it really is it's really involved, you might say, in Australia culture, the society, the economy. It's all very much there, and it is the background, you might say, for how people are able to make up their minds and wonder about what's happening. And so I think that realizing that is very, very important. It also, of course, is the case that WILP particularly has always put a lot of effort into what is not, you might say, attack, but rather into working with people to reduce conflict. And so getting nuclear submarines obviously is not something that we would advocate or in fact be prepared to go with, because that is just raising the ante for, and mean the ante in both senses, to just, make everybody make more conflict, more people involved in conflict of one sort or another. And it really is very important, I think, to be aware of that, because it's what is it? It really is very easy for a lot of people to just think that the military is doing its stuff and it's doing good things, which is here inside Australia as well as outside. And similarly, it is I think too that it is the case that for many people, the military is actually a good thing. And although not everybody wants to go down to the War Memorial these days, the fact is that really it's the Anzac Treaty and so forth have really been, I would suggest, overblown in terms of their meaning for people here. So getting back really to what we can do in terms of the nuclear submarine, which I can tell is the topic of the moment, it seems to me that what we most need to do is look at it from the point of view of the effect that militarisation is here in Australia, that it is ingrained, and it really is something that's going to have an impact, I would think, on the general population in terms of the way they are going to look at it. I mean, some people are going to think it's a great idea having fancy weapons, and other people are going to look at it very differently. And of course, what we also need to, I think, become very, very involved in, if we really care about this, is that what we ought to be doing is actually helping get people to back off what are really very aggressive decisions being made, such as this one about the nuclear submarines. Instead, people should be looking at ways to go out there, and this is very much what WILF does in various countries, and it is something that needs to be done. Instead of going after people we don't like, it's a matter of trying to reduce conflict, not to up the ante.
Thank you, Margot. Lots to think about there, but let's move on, keep this moving, and we'll go now to Allan Behm. Now, Allan is, of all the people we've got, he's the one who needs the least introduction. He's had a long career as a senior officer in the Australian Public Service, and currently he's the director of the International and Security Affairs Programme at the Australia Institute, a Canberra-based think tank. He specialises in the interface between policy and politics, and he's written at length about what he terms the securitisation of Australian society. So, Allan, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking to you as yet another ancient white male from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples in Canberra, and I pay my respects to their ancestors and elders past and present. I'm very much aware that I think over half of the people attending this session this afternoon are women, and I think that it is a critically important thing that the voices of women are much, much more heard in the articulation and delivery of our public policy. And it's public policy that I want to touch upon this afternoon to look at what I think is a very insidious consequence of militarism in Australia, which is the securitisation of so much of our public policy and the securitisation of the landscape, actually, in the national capital where I live. Let me deal first with the securitisation of public policy. This is a function that has been underway in Australia for quite a long time. It's surreptitious, it's insidious, and it is deeply cynical. It's what happens when a very wicked problem confronts a government which lacks the ability to address that problem using the normal tools of public administration. Not only does securitisation represent a highly cynical approach to public policy, but it actually reveals the impotence of government. So what governments have tended to do is to exaggerate the danger and threat and overall strategic significance of big national issues, and then try to resolve them by throwing the military at it. There are many examples of this. I'll only give you a couple so that you can sort of, as I say, roll the lolly around your mouth and then spit it out, I guess. The best example, I think, most recently was John Howard's decision to address the child sexual abuse problems in the Northern Territory by appointing a Major General to take over. And you can ask any Indigenous person in Northern Australia and they will tell you that that particular intervention, as it was called, was disastrous. But it wasn't just the Howard government. You'll recall also that the Rudd and Gillard governments also maintained that intervention until it died under the weight of its own ineptitude. More recently, and I'm really talking about just the last couple of years, we've had the amazing spectacle of the bushfires, where the person who doesn't hold a hose decided that he'd maintain his holiday over there in Honolulu until the heat became too intense. And I'm not talking about the heat of the fires, I'm talking about the political heat. So he withdraws to Australia and scrabbles around for something dramatic and theatrical to do. So as the fires burn their way through the forests and people are being rescued from Malakuta and driven around in trucks, he conducts a national call out of the ADF. Now, these are people who are not trained in firefighting. They have the same level of competence that I have. And I have actually fought a fire once and I was in great danger because all I had was a whole lot of branches to beat the flames with. Now, you don't use your military for things like that unless what you want to do is to draw massive attention to this great enactment that you've initiated. So you militarize the problem, you securitize the problem by calling out all of the soldiers. Now, in fact, most of them got nowhere near a fire. They just drew a few days' pay for being called out. But it was the theatre and the drama of it which is so cynical. More recently, we've seen the deployment of Australian Defence Force people to walk around hand in hand with police officers in Western Sydney.
Yes.
Now, those ADF people have no authority. They can't arrest anybody. They just can't do anything except look ferocious. And in fact, for the most part, they look silly because they know that they're there with no power, but simply to, as it were, expand the number of people in uniforms and to apply more boots on the ground, an expression I particularly loathe, I might say. And then if that's not enough, we then securitize the rollout of the vaccines that we don't have by getting a lieutenant general that's the same level as the chief of the army to be in charge of the COVID-19 vaccine program. So you securitize that as well. As I say, it's cynical and it is an expression of the impotence of government. And I just want to sort of conclude my remarks by talking a little bit about what I call the securitization of the landscape. I live in Canberra, as I told you, and I live not very far from the War Memorial. I never go there. I used to go there from time to time because a lot of my ancestors died in war, but I don't go there anymore because it's become a stately pleasure dome for people of warped sensibilities to go and look at how we kill each other. It's a museum, not a memorial. And so we're building more of it, $500 million more of it, so that people can just see how unsuccessful we were in the failures that we recognise Iraq and Afghanistan to have been. If you look where Parliament House is in Canberra, you'll find that the buildings which are nearest to it are all of them the buildings that house the power instruments of the state. The Department of Defence, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Office of National Intelligence, ASIO, and not to leave out anybody else, the Department of Home Affairs. They're all located within easy walking distance of the ministerial wing at Parliament House. Where do you think we have the departments of health and social security and all of those departments, education, which are deeply involved in the construct of human security in this country? Well, they're miles away. It's the landscape closest to our government is highly securitized. And if all of that is not deeply symbolic of a fundamental pathology in this country, which legitimizes and normalizes militarization, then I can't think of a better way to do it. And in my final remarks, may I just say that as I'm looking here at the moment at all of the people who are sitting around, there are people, I think, in the chat room here who are much better qualified actually than I am to talk about the implicit consequences of militarization. And one of them is Sister Patricia Fox, who's a most wonderful person who can tell you in great detail what happens in a country like the Philippines, which is a very highly militarized country, in the overall management, not only of very poor people, but particularly of women in a very poor country like the Philippines. And it's that insidious expansion of the power of the military and the military way of thinking that ultimately creates the greatest threat to the well-being and the happiness of individuals and the harmony and inclusiveness of societies. We should think very deeply about all of that. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for speaking to us, Allan. Allan has written extensively, and I do invite you to track him down and read some of his work. I read an article of his about the submarines just yesterday, I think. And our final speaker on the panel is Bevan Ramsden. And Bevan is from the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, or IPAN. He's a one-time telecommunications engineer, but he too is a long-time peace activist. He's very busy back in the days of the Vietnam War and the moratorium campaign. He advocates for Australia's independence and is a past member of IPAN's coordinating committee. IPAN, which was another of the founding organisations in raising peace, has been building a national network of peace groups and individuals concerned about Australia's military stance and its foreign policy. Bevan.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking today on the land of the Bridgegul and Gadigal people who have never ceded sovereignty of their land, and I acknowledge that and pay my respects to their elders and leaders past and present. I'm very happy to be able to support and make a contribution to this Raising Peace Festival because a peaceful environment in which we can enjoy life is a state which I believe 99% of the people on this planet wish for. Speaking as an Australian and in respect to wars that Australia's recently been engaged in, we only have to look at Vietnam, Afghanistan and Iraq, these three wars, to recognise the lies that have been told and the public manipulations that occurred to support these illegal, immoral and disastrous wars, resulting in millions of deaths and injuries to the peoples of the countries concerned. Essential civil infrastructures have been destroyed and their living environments poisoned, forcing millions to flee their countries as refugees. Further, it's taken a toll on our own ADF in deaths, injuries and suicides from wars we should never have been involved in. And we should not forget the huge financial waste on these wars, financial resources that could have been used to address social, including health needs in Australia and the challenges of human-induced climate change. I believe in order to prevent a repeat of these war disasters, we need to look at the reasons and the motivations for Australia's involvement in these US-led interventionist wars. The bottom line is the Australia-US alliance, which has grown out of the ANZUS Treaty. At its core is the belief held by the leaders of the two major political parties that Australia must cling to the coattails of the US military and follow them into these interventionist wars in order to pay what some commentators call an insurance premium. So they will come to our rescue if we come under military threat. However, there is nothing in the ANZUS Treaty that guarantees this degree of protection. But the treaty has enabled the United States to establish vital military communication facilities on our soil. Pine Gap not only provides targeting information, enabling the US with a US drone assassination program, but also provides the United States with the surveillance data necessary for them to launch nuclear missiles. The communication station at Northwest Cape in WA enables the United States Navy to communicate with their nuclear missile carrying submarines and provide the trigger signal for the launch of those weapons. The Force Posture Agreement between the US and Australian governments enables the stationing of up to 2,500 US Marines in Darwin every year and allows the United States military unimpeded access to our ports for their warships and to our airstrips for their fighters and bombers. It allows for the United States to store munitions, spare parts and fuel on our shores. And now the recently announced AUKUS partnership between Australia, the UK and the US will double or triple the number of US troops stationed in Australia and will allow for increased storage of supplies for war, including tanks and military vehicles. The question is why? Why is this necessary? The only logical answer is preparations for war, and the obvious target is China. Our political leadership has sold out our sovereignty. Australia has become one of the platforms from which the United States can prosecute war. The recently announced plans to acquire nuclear submarines using US nuclear propulsion technology will further tie Australia to the US and its war plans. Our political leaders have not made our country safer, they've made it vulnerable to missile attack by whoever is an enemy of the United States, and they have plenty. We who wish Australia to pursue peace and keep out of wars have a huge challenge, but it is not one from which to shrink. We have the moral high ground on our side and potentially the support of all those who wish to live in peace. For me, this is active work with IPAN, the Independent Peaceful Australia Network, which Nick has just mentioned, which promotes an independent Australian foreign policy and peaceful resolution to international conflicts. And IPAN opposes the establishment of any foreign military bases on their soil and deployment of foreign troops or military hardware in Australia and the Asia Pacific. But underpinning these aims is the understanding that Australia's close alliance with the United States, its foreign policy, and its illegal and immoral military expeditions, together with the US military bases on our soil, represents a major impediment to Australia adopting a peaceful outlook and in seeking peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with our neighbours. IPAN is currently conducting a people's inquiry into the costs and consequences of Australia's involvement in these wars, and has received some 250 submissions, which have come in from lawyers, a Supreme Court judge, ex-Australian military personnel, writers, academics, and others who care for peace. We need to promote the vision of a world without war. We need also to understand the causes of war and develop effective strategies to expose those causes and those who perpetrate them. We need to inspire and draw together an ever-increasing number of peace workers and peace agitators focused on mobilising mass support for peace and isolating and removing from political authority those who propagate war. We need to see the military-industrial complexes which feed on war for profit closed. We need our government to include a Minister for Peace, leading a Ministry for Peace and a well-resourced diplomatic service to enable Australia to engage in and promote peaceful resolution to conflict. I'll close by saying a famous person once said, "Some people see the world as it is, wring their hands in despair and cry, why? I see things as they could be and raise my fist and cry, why not?" Thank you.
Thank you, Bevan. Well, now we've got to the stage where you've heard from all the speakers, and I invite you to put your questions into the chat and we'll answer them as best we can. I've, in the meantime, got just something I'd like to read from Hugh White, who said, and this he wrote in the Saturday paper on Saturday, "We in Australia simply cannot plan our future on the assumption that the US will always be there for us, no matter how many nuclear subs we buy. And if the US, by miscalculation, does find itself at war with China, we absolutely cannot assume that it would win." And in finishing this article, he writes about Morrison. He says, "He has tied Australia to a deal that undermines our sovereign capabilities, overspends on hardware we can barely be confident of operating, and drags us closer to the front line of war we may have no interest in fighting." That was Hugh White writing in the... Okay, so we're waiting for your questions. One question I've seen that's popped up already, a couple of things I'll say about it. Margaret Pistorius asked, how do we involve young people in the campaign? And I would urge people to look at the chat, because there are many, many ways that any of us who are involved at the moment can involve ourselves by contacting one or the other of the groups or organizations, or looking at the material that's there in the chat. But I would like to hear from the panelists, how do we engage young people in this campaign? Because as Allan said, we're all, we tend to be old, white, middle-aged, mainly male, Margot.
Can I say something on that?
Certainly.
It's certainly the case that I think with our organisation, we are making some effort to involve younger people. And I think the problem that we've run into is that it's kind of hard to find the organised groups that you might work with, but it is still worth trying. And I think a lot of younger people actually, if you look at the people, for instance, who are working on climate change and running events on that trajectory, I think if you look at that, I think they would find many who would be equally happy to put effort into this business about the submarines, and in effect, the whole idea of stopping being, having an apron string tying us to the US, which may or may not be helpful in the future.
Yep.
Might I say something also, please, Nick?
Please do.
I'm in the very fortunate position of working with mostly very young people. When I can only speak for myself, but in my mid-70s, I could never have imagined that I'd be working with 25 to 40-year-olds day in, day out on a host of very progressive issues. Most of them work in climate change because that is the matter of the greatest importance in the Australia Institute at the moment, but others of them work on equity, gender issues, fair pay for fair work, the gig economy, all of those sorts of things. What I've found is that they don't join groups much, but they're very, very passionate about the things that we used to be passionate about and for which we used to form groups. They get out there on the streets. They just don't join up in movements. So I think what we've got to do is to understand that there are actually different ways of delivering our messages. And if you watch, and I've got a 24-year-old daughter, and she is extremely active, but she works almost totally through social media networks. So I think that we've got to be very modern in the way in which we reach out and play into the way in which youth today, just as idealistic as ever we were, but they have a different way of delivering on it. And I think it's our problem, not theirs. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Anyone else want to comment on this question of involving the youth? Okay, I've got another question. Oh, sorry, was that you putting your hand up, John?
Oh, well, I mean, only that the steering committee of the No First Youth campaign has almost got sort of, I won't say two separate groups, but two groups of people that you can distinguish, but who do work very closely with each other. And one is a group of grumpy old men, which I suppose includes myself and a couple of retired diplomats and those sort of people. And then there's a group of exceedingly cool young women who are very, very energetic and very, very cyber savvy. And mostly they're two groups of people who aren't used to talking to each other. And we do talk to each other and it's great.
Okay. All right, now I've got a question here addressed to Allan from Michael Little. And he asks, how much has AUKUS, the new agreement, compromised our alliance with France and our reputation with other European states?
Thanks, Nick. It's actually Skady. I'm using my partner's computer, so I'm sorry about that. Sorry, Allan. Yeah, I was just interested because I work with the Sydney Peace Foundation at the University of Sydney, and I really would like your valued opinion on the extent of the fracture now with France, but also with other European states. Because I myself believe that Australian foreign policy, as has been demonstrated in this and other issues, is frankly embarrassing. I'm ashamed about foreign policy approach.
You're muted, Allan.
You are right. It is Sadie, isn't it, that I'm talking to?
Elizabeth.
Look, it is a really, really important question, and it's one that I think all of us could discuss all afternoon. But let me just put an imaginary scenario in front of all of you, and you might just tell me whether you think that there's any more incompetent a way of achieving a result. And it goes like this. You want to poke China in the eye. So to do that, you poke France in the eye, Indonesia, Malaysia, New Zealand, and then you advertise to the world how irrelevant you are when the President of the United States can't even remember your name.
Yeah.
Now, that shows imbecile diplomacy, actually. I'm a former diplomat, and I'm ashamed to think that the department of which I was once a member would behave and transact business in anything like that way. The French are understandably and rightfully outraged by this, when only a fortnight ago, our ministers were in Paris telling them how the whole project was proceeding brilliantly now that they'd intervened. And 2 weeks later, the French call us out for being treacherous liars. And I can't see that the French are wrong in this. Yeah. The fact that they've withdrawn their ambassadors from both Canberra and Washington is extremely telling. And it shows too that the Americans did not think through what the consequences might be for them of Australia welshing on a contract on the submarine. Now look, the submarine contract was in deep and diabolical problem anyway, and God only knows how that would have resolved itself over time. But there are ways of resolving problems short of welching on the contract. Our diplomacy at the moment in Southeast Asia is abysmal. we took no care to have any conversations with any of the leaders of Southeast Asia. And so we get a really beautifully written piece just this morning from Marty Natalegawa, the former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, calling us out for the incompetence and bumbling fools that we are. You'll find that piece on the APLN site, published this morning. In general, I think we have to take stock of ourselves. We have to look at the pathologies that cause us to behave the way in which we do. The pathologies around racism, around misogyny, around the fundamental lack of self-confidence that we have as a nation. Allan Gingel's expression is fear of abandonment. The consequences of isolation, which have turned us into fawning acolytes. And the inability that we have to find solutions to our own problems, but to find other people's solutions to their problems and then apply those solutions to ourselves. A.A. Phillips called that the cultural cringe, and we're still pretty good at that. P.J. Keating called it tugging the forelock, and I still think that we're past masters at that too. So in essence, we've got to recognise that we've got some problems and then set about talking to each other about it. People will deny that we're a racist country and equally fail to understand why it is that we can't make peace and make at one-ment with the first peoples of this country.
Yeah.
Well, I think we all know why we can't do it, and yet the government is in deep denial from Turnbull through to where we are at the moment. So we've got to understand what drives us to the silliness that we commit, address those problems, and I don't know they're that hard to address, and then get on with being a country that looks at its security with its neighbours rather than looking at its security as being against its neighbours. Security against your neighbours is about warfare. Security with your neighbours is about diplomacy.
Yes, yes.
And also, Allan, I really appreciate your comments, but also we shouldn't be continuing to follow a fading superpower like the United States, who has a history of betraying its allies. You just have to look at North Syria and how it left the Kurds. You know, so many people in the Kurdish community died when America just arbitrarily pulled out. So I really appreciate hearing from you today. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right, I've got another question from Frank Hutchinson. He would like the panel to talk about the importance of history telling.
Honesty in history telling.
Okay, Frank, over to you. You can answer your own question.
Thank you very much. I'm involved in the International Museums for Peace. And one of the key issues that we're concerned about is the ways in which museums often represent warfare. And there's a failure often to look at issues of how do we create cultures of peace. That relates to questions of honesty in history telling. Allan mentioned in his introductory remarks that recently the Australian War Memorial in Canberra there is an expenditure of some $500 million on so-called refurbishing the War Memorial Museum. The question that I ask the panel is, how important is it to have honesty in history telling? And I'm thinking not just for the adults, but for the children in our schools. And what can we do to enhance, if you like, the prospects of moving towards cultures of peace and shifting away from the securitisation of our society that Allan spoke about? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I quoted in my speech the Education Minister, Alan Tudge, who said that Anzac Day was the most sacred of all days. But the full quote is that he was talking about the national history curriculum that is up for review. And this is only about a week ago. And the full quote goes, Anzac Day should not be contested. Anzac Day is the most sacred of all days. And Anzac Day is something that should be contested in our national curriculum. but you have the Conservatives in power at the moment, and they're pushing this line about the glorification of what Australia did, and the history around Anzac Day is never spoken about. They never talk about the arrangement that the British had with the Russian Empire, the Tsars. The British were going to give them Constantinople, and the British were going to get the present day Iran and its oil. That was the deal. And at the same time, when the Anzacs ran up the beach, that was the time when Italy declared war, because Italy wanted colonies, and Britain said, if you go to war against Austria, we will give you colonies in Africa and various other places. And so that was the background. Now the individual soldiers themselves were brave and did the right thing as far as they could. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the historical context, and that is never ever brought up. There's just this, and the history of the people who came back. His surname was Throssell. Throssell won a VC, and he got up and he said this wasn't a war for good; it was a war for imperialism. And he was so badly treated he committed suicide. He was an actual VC winner, and all this is never talked about. And also the referendum. So I couldn't agree with you more. We must do more about Anzac Day. And as a teacher, it was very hard to present this, because there was the RSL would come into the school, and there'd be, the last post would be blown and so on. So it's very difficult to stand up for it, but it must be done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Diane, can I talk with you directly for a moment? I know that Margaret Pistorius is in the audience, and I believe she wants to ask a question. And I'll just sort of prompt her in a way, because it's my belief that Australia's military posture is not purely an internal matter. There are external forces at work, and I'm thinking of the military-industrial complex. And I wonder if Margaret would like to put a question to the panel along those lines. Can you find Margaret, Diane?
Margaret will have to unmute herself if she wishes to ask a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you there, Margaret?
Too busy writing.
All right. Well, let me put that question to the panel. Are we being manipulated by the forces that make a great deal of money out of warfare?
Well, if I could just add to what Allan and both Denis have said, it is really impressive how much we now have involvement of armaments manufacturers from overseas. Many of them now have branches here in Australia, and really having some, influence in what's going on. And I think the public at large probably doesn't understand that, and it's not really talked about very much, but it certainly is a very important aspect of what's going on, particularly too with some of these people do, armaments groups, they work with people at universities, they do stuff with school children, etc. They really work quite hard at being involved in that.
Thank you, Margaret. John, you're muted still. You're muted, John.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're seeing one particular arms complex, the US one, pitted against another arms complex which is not quite so influential, namely the French one. and which is seen as being in some kind of competition. And I mean, the interesting thing is that from a purely military point of view, the conventional sub is as good or better than the nuclear powered sub. And I'd draw all your attention to the video that I posted a couple of days ago. It's on YouTube, dates from back in 2011. An Australian Collins class submarine evading a US nuclear submarine and sinking in inverted commas because it's an exercise, a United States destroyer. And they're very pleased with themselves, and they play the land down under after they've done it.
Yeah. Any other comments on that from Bevan or Denis? Denis?
Oh, I think that there is a very strong push from international arms companies, and there's particularly the British and the Europeans and the Americans, but there's also the insidious use of Israeli arms companies as well. And so it's a complex and complicated feature. But what makes it worse is the fact that politicians, and you could start to rattle them off, you know, like Kim Beazley, Christopher Pyne, and so it goes on. You know, they're all involved in this, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship between politicians and between government. Between arms corporations and government. It's a very cozy, sweet relationship, and of course, because the cone of secrecy comes over it, and commercial in confidence, it's very hard to prize out the figures. You know, we've had the experience in any bases. We've done all the right things. We've asked the Defence Department. They refused to answer our question. We went through Senate estimates, and they gave us a whole set of lies rather than tell us what something cost. So that's the sort of secrecy and duplicity that we have to put up with it, and we call ourselves a democracy.
Yeah.
Nick, can I just jump in there? The question was about manipulation of the public, you know, with talk, which gets us into wars. And they simply use often straight out lies and repeat them, right? The weapons of mass destruction lie that was used to justify going into Iraq was proven a lie, and they knew it. And they've been told by the UN weapons inspectors that it was not true. But they repeated it endlessly as a justification. Currently, we're being subject to this threat to sea lanes in the South China Sea, that China is somehow a threat to freedom of navigation. Now, any sensible thinking person knows that those trade routes, those sea trade routes, are essential to China itself to maintain its trade with the world. Why on earth would they want to disrupt their own trade routes? But nevertheless, they keep repeating as if China is threatening the sea lanes in that area, which it's not.
Yeah.
Just to support Bevan, it's about othering, isn't it? Someone that doesn't look like us, doesn't have the same culture. It's continuing that narrative which was used with the so-called children overboard, you know, sort of, you know, crap that was heard many years ago. And unfortunately, it works with majority of people that don't have such a wide or deep knowledge of, you know, geopolitics. So you're quite right, Bevan.
Okay, thank you. I don't know who that was speaking, but thank you.
Skady.
Okay, Skady, thank you.
I just want to say there are 2 more questions waiting for you.
Yes, tell who's got them. I can't find them on this chat at the moment.
Okay, I can tell you. There's one from.
Sorry, Skady. Someone's sending Nick the questions. But we've got Frank with his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
That's right.
Okay, 2 questions waiting though.
Nick, there's a suggestion that someone called Grace Russell Jarvie be asked to speak. She's 21 and has lots of good things to say.
Okay, yep, Grace, let's hear from you.
Hello. No, I wasn't actually planning to speak, but yeah, way back to much earlier in the conversation when people were talking about getting more young people involved. And yeah, I actually am just here because I saw this on Facebook quite randomly. And yeah, I was quite surprised to see, like, of course, no offense, but there's not many people my age involved in these kinds of events often. And yeah, I think it's quite surprising because certainly I go to Sydney University, and certainly many of my cohort and my generation in general are very passionate about these issues. And I think, yeah, there's just perhaps been a lack of like peace activism on social media, really like reaching the people, well, reaching my generation in general. And yeah, so I'm definitely keen to get more involved and get more of my friends and stuff involved.
Look, thank you, Grace, but that's just what's needed, because us old guys are a little bit at a loss to know how to break through and get you people motivated and moving and active. And there's a desperate need for that right now, because the way I see it, and all the conversation has been heading this way, the militarization that we see growing within the Australian community is leading us on a path that has war as its almost inevitable destination if we carry on as we are. And it's deeply concerning to me and to everybody else on the panel I know, and I think probably to most people in the audience, but that's the path we'll be led down unless there's a bit more activity within the general community. And I want to say to everybody, whilst I've got the opportunity, the call that I want to give to our leaders is bring us peace. Bring us peace, not war. Now, let's move on to
and especially so given that if we go down the path of war, the probability of it escalating into a nuclear war in which the joint facilities and possibly 1 or 2 Australian cities, which basically means us, get to be turned into firestorms, is as great as it has ever been.
And I would say greater now that we're going to be acquiring nuclear submarines.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right.
Nick, I know there are a lot of people with their hands up, but there was, I think it's someone called Zol. I'm not sure how to pronounce their name. She has interests with women in the Pacific, and she's asking about any ideas as to how Australian peace people can use this alliance to increase our regional resistance.
Yes, I know Zol very well. Zol, we do have a good relationship with people in Guam and in the Philippines, but I know you would feel that's not sufficient, and we don't feel it's sufficient either. But we have lost contact with a lot of people, on the other island nations, and we do need to lift our game there. Even with New Zealand, in some ways, we don't include New Zealand often enough in our calculations. So Zola's put a finger on something that's very important.
So there is a newly formed organisation or network.
And mute me, please. Thank you. Thank you, Denis. I appreciate that. Yes, I know that we've got connections. We've been talking. I just feel it's important to talk here right now because, as a lot of you wonderful gentlemen have pointed out, there's a lot of white men doing a lot of talking right now. But that's not why I want to talk. I just wanted to say that because just that moment there, I felt very silenced. So that's not what we're on about, right, brothers? So thank you, Denis, for your response. Yes, I know you've got contact with Guam, and but you know, we're talking about how to get the younger generations involved. So important. I'm a Greenham Common woman, so you know, like I've got connections around the planet, but I'm particularly focused on the Pacific. And the contacts I've been having with my friends out there about what do we call this one? I call it us, but what is it called?
AUKUS.
Okay, I prefer us. Thank you for taking it on. But if we're going, this is a wonderful golden opportunity to reach out around the region. The amazing militarization is taking place in the Pacific. You know, we've got all these different islands of people, and they're connected up. But, you know, Australia getting engaged in that would really assist them and assist us. So I was just wondering what different, there's so many different organizations here. I'm just wondering what different organizations are doing and what could be done.
So there is a Pacific Peace Network that's been formed. We've had a number of Zoom meetings in recent days. IPAN is a member of it, and there are people from Guam, Hawaii, New Zealand, Philippines, South Korea, Okinawa involved with it. I could give you the reference to that if you...
No, I have their contact. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have the feeling that
I just thought we could perhaps have a discussion about that, but that's all right.
There are other people who have got their hands up to ask questions, and I'm going to try and take them in order now. Kim Morris, you have a question.
Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Nick. So I just want to also quickly add to the engagement of young people. I work with young people who are engaged in hospital management, or not hospital management, but hospital and healthcare with chronic illness. And the takeaway from that is usually having a young person there on the panel and their voice in it. And I cannot begin to say how far that goes, and is definitely something to consider on engagement. But my question is actually sort of as a health worker and as a graduate from Sydney Uni's Peace and Conflict Studies. The securitization of health has produced effective action in some health areas, albeit problematic in my opinion. For example, more recently in the current pandemic, the use of security language to engage public action for lockdown, isolation, vaccination has been effective to recruit the public to rally against the invader, in this case, which is COVID, in a language that is en masse comprehensible. When securitization has provided some positive action for health and social outcomes, such as poverty as well, how do we draw the line as peacemakers and say, this level of securitization is too much, but that was okay? Or more so, what is an effective alternative when securitization is understandable by much of the public?
Good question. Perhaps I ought to take that one, at least to start with. I think it is interesting in the way in which we have our political discourse in Australia, how often our politicians reach into the language of warfare to describe a problem and how you might handle it. Whether it's the war on poverty or the battle against whatever it is, or the coronavirus as an invader. I find a lot of those metaphors to be rather misleading, actually, because what they do is play in the domain of fear. And fear is a very powerful stimulus, make no mistake about it. And people who are well into warfare know a lot about how you create it and then play on it. But actually, in a society such as ours, we might have hoped that we had a much more nuanced way of talking to each other about the sorts of problems we've got to deal with, including the COVID virus. I don't mind us describing a battle against cancer if we find that that's a useful way of describing it, but it's actually a battle that nobody ever wins, by the way. Not ultimately. We all have a 70 span, and some of us have got a bit over that. So I feel that I'm doing pretty well at the wicket at the moment. But the point I'm really making is quite a serious one. And that is that we should be much more careful in our use of language. We ought to know what we're saying. We use language like sovereign. We use that all the time these days. So the Prime Minister will talk about a sovereign capability to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine. What makes it sovereign? Well, it's in Australia, I think is what makes it sovereign. It's not owned by the government. In fact, the government used to own it and sold it, as it sold anything and everything it could possibly find that my parents' generation invested in as taxpayers in order to reduce the taxes for me. But that's another story, by the way. So the important thing, I think, in public policy is always to use language which is appropriate and language which will bring the public along with you in coming to an agreed solution to a problem, rather than corralling them and frightening them into an answer to a problem. And securitization, by and large, frightens people into agreement, whereas I think discourse and conversation, not debate, but conversation and discourse actually bring people into agreement and alignment. And I think we ought to use that a lot more and just give up the language of warfare a bit.
Thank you.
Could I answer? I think, yeah, is it Nikki? I think her name was it Nikki?
Kim.
Tim.
Look, there was an article by Julia Baird a few weeks ago talking about Fruin being in charge of the medical issue, and she was complaining that nurse practitioners were not on that committee, and that that was an example of an overuse of the military, and that you know, the people who are on the front line are doctors and nurses, and sometimes nurses are more important than doctors because the nurses are there more often than the doctors, so they were sidelined, and the military was given the headline. We had an incident here in the suburb where I live in Glebe, where a building was locked down for people who are very needy. They had 25 policemen there, and they had 6 medical staff there. You know, this is and the alarm that went through. These were people who were used to be living on the street, and the alarm that the police uniforms caused was very unhealthy, and that. There is a role for the military in a natural disaster, in a pandemic, where they've got logistical systems such as planes and trucks and so on. They shouldn't be given civilian policing roles, and that's where the line is, that the civilian police role and the uniforms should be kept to a minimum, and nurses and doctors should be kept at a maximum. That's my feeling on it.
Well said, Denis.
Nick, there was a question from before that I think might have got forgotten. It's from Emmanuel, and he says here, I am new to nonviolent thinking. Why can't there be effective communication between countries rather than being provocative and stationing arms close to countries they dislike? There's also a question about you know, the effect of AUKUS on our regional neighbours.
Yeah, a few questions about AUKUS. Yeah, it is now. That was just a moment. Let me look. That was Emmanuel. Is Emmanuel there?
Yes, that's me here.
Okay, ask your question.
Yeah, so why can't countries communicate effectively with each other rather than building tensions offshore? Or yeah, I'm new to non-violence, so I'm still learning my way through this, but to me, the logical thing would be to send a negotiator or some peace person to that country to sit down and talk about it, rather than showing their military might offshore.
I think probably there are many answers. They're all going to have diplomacy in the word. Bevan? Bevan?
I think John's got a hand up too.
Oh.
One of the answers to that is simply that you take one country and one war, Iraq. The war in Iraq was because the United States and the energy companies that put the president into power wanted access to Iraqi oil. Saddam Hussein had nationalised the oil resources and shut out Western interests. Now, you go to Iraq and look at what's happening. Shell, BP, Exxon Mobil, they're all well in there with their getting the oil out and refining and so on, making the money out of it. The same thing happened with Gaddafi in Libya. He nationalised the oil and shut out Western interests, and they got rid of him about that same time and opened it up to Western oil. And there's also a case in Afghanistan where an oil pipeline was a significant factor. In a country seeking to extend its access to energy and to its corporations making money out of it. You know, that's the bottom line. It's not nice, but they don't act nicely. They act in their interests.
John? John?
Oh, yeah, years ago, I remember doing a term essay on World War I, and I did the whole thing all over again in 2014. And the thing that comes out is that nothing much has changed between 1914 and now. People talk about diplomacy and how it would be wonderful if we all talked to each other. But then when there comes to be an actual crisis, people shout past each other in ways that are positively calculated to make the situation worse. In a way, this is a non-answer to your question, but it's an answer at the same time. It seems as if we have an almost perverse wish to take a situation which might be a crisis, but a crisis that could be solved, and to make it as unsolvable as we possibly can by doing things that are absolutely calculated to make it worse, to exacerbate it, and to send the whole thing off the rails completely. And we're seeing that happen also with our relationship with China. Yes, the Chinese were being difficult, but our end of things was to make things easier, not more difficult. So what did we do? We made it even more difficult, not easier.
Yeah. Now,
and it almost feels like it was.
Nick, I'd better add one more thing to this.
Please.
And it's this. Almost all of the business of international relations is conducted by men.
Yes.
Very, very few women are in this business. Now, right at the moment, we're celebrating the end of the chancellorship of Angela Merkel. And I just ask all of you to think about what Europe might look like now if it hadn't been for the fact that she was chancellor for such a long period of time and did quite remarkable things with respect to Syrian refugees, for which Germany has now worked out that she did the right thing because they've had an extremely good inclusion program. She's maybe done some interesting things with Putin, but she's been able to keep Putin very well in play. She's been able to manage a fabulous relationship with France, which wasn't so good in most of the 20th century. So I think that one of the key problems here, Emmanuel, is that it's blokes' rules played by blokes. And we may as well consign the whole of the international relations enterprise to the ARL or some other totally bloke organisation so that we can go and punch the living bejesus out of each other. So really, I mean, what we've got to do is to exploit the extended talents of our society and have many, many more women who are in positions of leadership and of authority and of negotiation. And I think we get entirely different results.
Oh, thank you so much, Allan. That's such a good contribution. That's marvellous. We have a question from Frank Vavassor, and we'll take Frank's question and then one from Margaret Behrlin. And then I think we've really got to think about winding up. Okay. So Frank, are you there? Come in, Frank.
Go on.
He may have left us. Okay. We'll move on then. Margaret Behrlin, are you there? No?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. Hello, everyone. And I'm a lot older than you old guys. But I can remember all of the Second World War. But which is why I've always been in the peace movement. But two things I want to say. One is that if you want to have more women involved in conversations, just make sure that every second person who speaks is a woman.
Yes, absolutely.
I had my hand up just forever and it never got noticed until just now. And that's a very good technique. But the other thing is, and Allan, thank you for what you said, but the thing is that in 2000, the Security Council unanimously passed the first, and I think only resolution that was proposed by a civil organisation, which is to do with women's power to be involved in peace negotiations for the very reason, for all the reasons you said, Allan, and for all the rest too, that when there is a war and they decide to stop it, the blokes go somewhere out of the country often to talk about what was to happen. And because they are not in contact with the real things that are going on in the world of their country, they come up with not very satisfactory peace agreements. And ever since women have finally managed to get a bit more say in being involved in peace agreements, and it's been hard work ever since 2000, then they've found that they now last at least 5 years longer if women are involved, and not very many women that is that either. Will you all please look up the UN Security Council resolution, Women, Peace and Security 1325, and the whole raft of other resolutions that make up this whole bank of UN resolutions that have tried to secure women a place in international diplomacy. And I couldn't agree with you more. The thing that makes me absolutely furious is that when a prime minister hears that some new threat or so-called threat, he doesn't think about how we could resolve that possible conflict. It's, oh, we've already just ordered some more missiles. Is it any wonder that one woman dies every week in Australia through mostly mild violence? And the coercive control is now being made part of the civilian law in various states of Australia is a direct transplant or representation of the coercive control that is represented in militarism and in this seeping militarisation through Australia. And Allan, you called it securitisation. That's exactly what Wilf's report is all about, the insidiousness, the tremendous threat to our democracy that is this increasing militarisation through every aspect of our society. That's the end of my speech.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just one last little thing, question. I'm sorry, I've forgotten who asked it now. What do you see are the long-term consequences that the latest military alliance in the region, especially in Southeast Asia, which already has several flashpoints. I guess you're saying, what do you see are the long-term consequences of the alliance?
This is the new agreement.
AUKUS.
Yeah.
AUKUS, sorry.
Yes. Could I start on that, please? I can't stay for too much longer because I've got another one at 4 o'clock and I haven't prepared for it yet. So I better get my skates on. But look, this new thing is not a pact or a treaty or even at this point an agreement. It is an announcement made by 3 government heads. Where it goes, nobody knows at this point. We've got 18 months, according to Morrison, that we will work out exactly what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, where we're going to do it and how much we're going to pay for it. And if all of that can be done in 18 months, it'll be the first time in Australia's history that that has occurred. I'm not holding my breath. In the region, the response has been very immediate, but you've got to break it into 2 major parts. There is the Southeast Asian response, which is essentially a fear of an arms race. And that is what Indonesia and Malaysia have both signalled already. The Singaporeans will signal that in due course, I expect, but in a much more muted way. And I'd be very, very interested to see in due course how the Thais and the Filipinos respond to that. They normally go very, very quietly and follow everybody else. But the speed of Indonesia's response, I think, was interesting. They're normally very measured and they take their time. Jam karet, it's called in Bahasa, rubber time. And they'll take quite a long time to come to a judgment as to what they should do. That they moved so quickly and cancelled Morrison's visit shows a high degree of irritation. North Asia, however, that's where the consequences can be very profound indeed. Australia is the first non-nuclear weapon state to pretend that it's going to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. There are at least 2 other non-nuclear weapon states in North Asia that would be particularly interested in the same capability. That's Japan and South Korea. And I can't imagine that they're going to stay reticent for too long if the Australian project goes ahead. And in my estimation, I've had a lot of experience in strategic analysis, but it's only my expectation, is that the decision taken by the United States, Britain and Australia is very destabilising in North Asia and could have extremely profound consequences, both in their force structure, but also in the way in which they may seek to play pressure games with China, understanding that the United States has now got another backer.
John?
And the North Koreans issued a ferocious statement just today denouncing it and talking about an arms race in Northeast Asia.
That's right.
Well, they know about that.
Yeah.
And because of this Global Day of Action, we're in contact with Malaysia, and Malaysia has identical sort of demonstrations that we have, you know, like put the money into the people, not into submarines, because that when we got the Collins class submarines, those countries that Allan mentioned all went and bought submarines off the whatever it's called, off the shelf, and at enormous cost. Not only a cost, but cost to things like education and health and so on. So it's quite a disastrous decision all round.
Yes. Could I just add my voice to that?
And a very authoritarian decision too. No democracy in that, no democratic process in making that decision.
Sorry, Margot.
Allan, I think you want to leave us. And
I would, and I'd like to thank you all very much. If I may, I've got 10 minutes in order to think about what I'm going to say next. And I hope that what I say next is not quite as disjointed as I've been this afternoon. So look, thank you all very much for listening to me. Please proceed and keep the pressure up. It's just so important. And I think the advice about having every second speaker as a woman, I might make the density a bit higher than that. 2 out of 3 should be women, I think, just to change the flavour of the meal. But Thank you all very much.
Thank
Good
you,
luck.
Allan. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Okay,
for
thank you.
the rest of us, I think it's very nearly time for us to wind up too.
Yes.
We've been going for close to 2 hours now. So look, thank you to everybody who's taken part. Thank you for your questions and your input. Thank you to the panel for your answers. I do recommend that you save the chat if you can, because there is a wealth of information in there. And you can save the chat. If down the bottom of the chat, you'll see to the right-hand corner, there's a little square with 3 dots in it. I believe if you click in that, you can, it says save chat. And you can save it, and then you can take away, you've got all the websites that people have put up there, various documents. The statement is up there, the statement that IPAN and other groups have issued. IPAN and the Anti-Basis group and other groups have issued. So I do encourage you to look at all that material. And as we've said during the course of the afternoon, it is imperative, it's on us as people, as citizens, it's on us to do something about this dreadful path that we find our country on. So I think that's the place at which to say, once again, thank you very much. And we'll do this again sometime. Okay, thank you.